The model here is for one of us to talk to another of us, have a conversation in which we learn about something that goes beyond what we see in the journals. And I think that all of us, whether it's personalities, and although Rebecca and I are by no means Brad and Angelina, I do think that there is often an intrigue that we have about how did somebody come to be who they are? Why did they do the work they did? And it always seems from the outside that this was all planned in some incredible way, and it just unfolded, life unfolded for them in these perfect ways until you actually talk to them and find out about the series of accidents and really, you know, odd events that brought them to do what they do. So the goal today is for us to talk to each other. I'll ask Rebecca a bunch of questions about what she's done over the course of her life. She will then have a chance to ask me some other questions that she wishes to. And hopefully, as a part of this, what you will see is something about the story behind the story. And again, you know, I feel like I have a deep need for knowing this kind of information. A friend of mine who is a poet would tell me about the background to why she had written a particular poem. Of course, the poem itself would never reveal any of that. And I would say, but I don't know, something like as a scientist, I need to know why you wrote it the way you did. And so she actually wrote a poem that was dedicated to me that had 3 footnotes in it, just so that I could be reassured that I was understanding it the way she had meant it. You can see what I do when I stand in front of an abstract painting. So, Rebecca Sachs is somebody whose mind I have just loved since the day she took a course with me. I had moved in the early 2000s, I think it was 2002, and Nalini Ambadi and I jointly taught a course on the neuroscience of emotion. And Rebecca was a student at MIT at the time. She took this course, and I would say she dramatically changed this course. Just the kind of questions that she asked and the areas of work that she pointed us to were so different from the way in which we thought, and yet it just seemed to me that that's how we ought to be thinking. So she has been an important person for me to follow for a long, long time. And then I've just watched her soar. She studied at MIT. She did a postdoc at Harvard. She was a junior fellow, one of very, very few people who are selected. In fact, I can't remember the last time a psychologist was selected to be part of the junior fellows at Harvard. And then she took a job back at MIT. So let me just begin by asking you to tell us a little bit, so that the audience and we are all on the same page, on the kinds of things that you study. When I read your work, you say that you're deeply interested in sort of how the brain ends up representing abstract pieces of information. Because from what we see at the neuronal level, it just seems almost unimaginable that something like that could produce the complexity of the kinds of thoughts that we end up having. And then you've done that in the context of developing a very rigorous program of work on theory of mind. So I just wanted you to tell the audience a little bit about the work, and then we'll backtrack and ask how you came to do it. So.
Yeah, sure. So the work that I was doing when I met you, and which I've kept doing ever since then, is about this thing called theory of mind, how we think about other people's thoughts, how we get inside other people's heads. And in psychology comes from developmental psychology and from clinical psychology. In developmental psychology, it comes from the study of this false belief task, which actually came from comparative psychology. So this is perfect for APS. Theory of mind is this topic that has kind of had its fingers in almost every piece of the APS pie. So the original puzzle is, if I want to know what you're going to do, or if I want to evaluate what you have done in the past, I need to know not only what you actually did in reality, but also what you were thinking at the time. So the original classic example of the false belief task as given to kids goes something like this. Maxie comes home and he puts his chocolate inside the blue drawer to eat later and goes outside to play. While he's outside and playing and can't see what's happening in the kitchen, his mother moves the chocolate from the blue drawer to the green drawer. When Maxie comes back in, where is he going to look for his chocolate? And the original findings back in the late 70s and early 80s were that, first of all, that chimpanzees were surprisingly bad at this task, and secondly, that 3-year-old human beings were surprisingly bad at this task, systematically predicting that he would look for his chocolate where it really was. instead of where he had left it. And then this task got a lot of attention in the early 80s when it turned out that children with autism also were selectively delayed in passing the task, much worse than would be predicted by their other intellectual difficulties. And so in the early 80s, there was a prediction that maybe that was because there was a particular brain system used in human beings to think about other people's thoughts. And so when neuroimaging became widely available in the late 90s and early 2000s, just when I went to grad school, the first thing we thought of was, well, let's try and see whether indeed that prediction is true, that there are a special group of brain regions. And at the time, we were one of a number of labs around the world trying this idea and found that indeed there are specific brain regions involved in thinking about other people's thoughts. And actually, the same brain regions were found by all the different labs that tried it, which was, I think, much more remarkable than we even knew at the time.
That's right. Just this morning, we were talking about failure to replicate. This is a nice moment where
it was this
everybody,
almost unique.
Yeah,
everybody agreed. Yeah. That set of brain regions and what they do, what they contribute, have been the kind of focus of one line of my research since then, because they seem like such an amazing opportunity to study an aspect of cognition which is interesting from a psychological perspective, interesting from a clinical perspective, has real-world implications, but also, as you said, is an example of something we cannot imagine neurons doing, right? It's just impossible to imagine a bunch of neurons sending action potentials, so a pattern of ones and zeros effectively over time, how that could constitute me thinking that you think that the chocolate is in the blue drawer. And I sometimes feel like if I could ever imagine how a pattern of activity over a group of neurons could constitute that thought, that we'd be done. Mm-hmm. That's sort of, it feels like probably more than a lifetime's worth of effort away, which is great, right? Lots of work to do.
Lots of work to do, but it is amongst our most fundamental questions. Psychologists don't make up lists of the top 10 questions that everybody should be solving, like some other fields do. I've heard philosophers, put up, Churchians will put up a list of 10 questions, and certainly if you are a student who enters, study of physics or something, you don't just pick up a problem and start to study it. There are identified and mapped out problems. We're not there yet, but I actually think that is a wonderful thing. We are still...
With $1 million prizes.
With $1 million, yes, exactly. But we really can decide, today that there is something that we want to study that's never been studied, and we can actually do the very first work on it, on very important things, like revenge. Why do we care about things like that? And so on. And so I think that this is a time, and we have to remember that we're only a century old. So if I think about the work that you've been doing on theory of mind, it seems to me that from the question about the chocolate being in one drawer versus the other, I mean, the applications are really numerous, right? When warring groups of people sit across, a table to try to negotiate, it just seems to me that one of the ways in which we fail is when we do not understand what the intention is in the mind of that other person.
Exactly.
And so I almost wish that there were some way in which we could image groups of people and show them what their brains are doing when they're thinking about the other.
This is almost a setup. We're doing that right now.
No, I don't know you're doing that. Oh, this is okay. Tell them. No, I had no idea.
Some of the work that we're doing in the lab right now is exactly imaging Arabs and Israelis while they're thinking about each other's perspectives and arguments and experiences in the conflict. Partly so right now it's not the second thing, not then using that to change what they do, but just starting as an initial basis to say, okay, well, here's a context where thinking about somebody else's thought really matters in the real world. Can we get at least a foundational sense of what are the kinds of differences in how we think about each other's thoughts that arise in these real-world disagreements, and then maybe use those as the grounds to try to either change negotiations or study how negotiations change those processes.
So I know you mentioned that we know that one of the limitations is that autistic kids, can't seem to do it quite in the same way as others do, which teaches us a whole lot. But do you see individual differences, even along sort of the more general sort of spectrum, where there are these kinds of individual differences, and can we use those differences to actually link up to behaviors, where some people just are very good at putting themselves in the minds of others, irrespective of where that other comes from?
This is one of the examples, of which I'm sure there are many, where you see the thing much more in real life than in the lab, right? So if you look around you, clearly there are people who are better than others at thinking about other people's thoughts. Interestingly, for adults, we don't have any good way of measuring that, because I think actually partly because adults are so good at thinking about each other's thoughts that we haven't come up with measures that capture that. You know, there aren't good ways in adulthood. There are good ways in kids, but there aren't good ways in adulthood of measuring the differences. There have been a whole series of really interesting attempts to figure out who would be, for example, among us, the theory of mind experts. And some of these ideas I think are lovely. Like some people have said, well, actors or novelists. Those would be the theory of mind experts. One idea I really liked is fortune tellers, like palm readers. Those would be the really good theory of mind experts, because they would be the people who would have to, from just meeting you, know so much about you that they could say something that felt meaningful and relevant and changed your mind about your life based on so little information. So these ideas are out there, but because there aren't any good, well-established tests, there's no way of knowing if those conjectures are right.
You're so right. So we failed at a bunch of experiments that Jason and I had tried, in which we thought that we would see variations between how you think about somebody who's just like yourself or very different from yourself. And we use simple things like race and gender difference. It doesn't work, because it turns out that we're, like you said, we're just so good at doing it that in some ways we're literally traversing what are standard differences that show up on behavioral tasks. The brain doesn't seem to care as much. It's just another person. You're trying to understand their mind, and you'll do it irrespective of who they are. We did find one difference that was pretty clear, and that was somebody who thinks politically very differently from you, right? So the medial PFC seems to kind of split off, going off into a slightly more ventral stream or a dorsal stream, depending on whether there's a match between the way this other person represents the world. And I think that in a modern world, we will give up lots of differences amongst ourselves, but we'll hang on to this thing that somebody has a representation of the world that is radically different from ours. And that means something to us. And we're going to continue to hang on to it because it's going to be important as a predictor or something. So I look forward to seeing you do more and more of this great work. But let me ask about the kinds of things we're here to talk about, which is how did you come to do this? And let me start by just asking about where you were born and raised, and who raised you, and who were they, and what were they like, and how did you choose this path to becoming a scientist rather than, you know, a poet or a chemist or whatever? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in Toronto, Canada, and the daughter of 2 lawyers, which led me to infer that law was what you would do if nothing else worked. It was the backup option. And, but my mother had wanted to be a scientist when she was growing up. She had always been doing sort of chemistry experiments, and her parents' basement had once blown up the attic, and went to college to do chemistry. And was, every time she entered the lab, she broke something. And after a semester of this, the chemistry professors told her that that was it. She couldn't be a chemist because she broke things too often. So she went on to be a lawyer as well. She wanted to be a chemist, she became a lawyer. And it's amazing, my mother's, just 1 generation older than me, and her experience was so different than mine in the experience of being a woman trying to do all of these things, both when she was trying to be a scientist, when the only scientist role model she could think of was Marie Curie. And that was why she wanted to be a chemist, which is totally different from my world in which there were female scientists everywhere. When she became a lawyer, actually her first job at a firm, when somebody took her aside and said, you should switch jobs because there's no way that a woman will get a permanent job in this firm. It's kind of amazing, the difference. Anyway, so I was raised, though, by my mother telling me I could be anything I wanted to be. And I remember wanting to be a fireman, and then wanting to be a captain of a ship, and then wanting to be a scientist. When I was about 10, I wanted to be a scientist. And I had heard about biochemistry. I had heard about the idea that everything was made up of atoms. I thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever heard. So I wanted to be a chemist. And then I slowly worked my way towards realizing that although the idea that something really complicated and emergent comes out of something really simple and tiny and mechanical, I guess is this continuous idea for me that I've always found that incredibly fascinating, to imagine how you could take something really simple and small and build up either a chair or then a body. So then I wanted to be a geneticist or a mind. I eventually decided that of all of these examples of small things generating big things, that the most interesting, amazing one was generating a mind out of a neuron. So when I was in high school, I decided I wanted to study the mind. And and got super lucky in going to college in a place where that was possible.
So say a little bit about the fact you left Canada and you went off to college in England.
I went to England.
And why did you do that?
Well, you know, as these things go, for all kinds of reasons. The summer I was 17, my father took me to England for a trip, and we went to Oxford for a day. And I thought, I can't believe this place exists. I thought of it as a place in novels. And I didn't even really think of it as a real option. It would never have occurred to me that a real person could go to Oxford. And I didn't know anybody who had ever gone to Oxford. And actually, I went because my mother is a very good person. I came back and I said, I loved Oxford, I really want to go. And my mother really didn't want me to go because it was very far away. I was always going to go to University of Toronto, which was next to my house, and live at home. That was always the plan. And she really didn't want me to be far away. And so she decided to prove to me it wouldn't be better for me to go to Oxford. So she did all this research about Oxford, about what kind of educational system it had and what kind of programs there were to prove it wasn't better.
It didn't work.
And the thing that I most liked about that program is this tutorial relationship. Actually, I love the educational system there, and I shouldn't go off because I will go off for a long time about the educational system there. But one thing that I really liked is that it's a very independent educational system where students are left to their own devices a lot. I like that your teachers don't mark you. So your teachers are your coaches. They're totally on your side. They have no mixed incentives because somebody else is grading you. So they're just there to help. I love that relationship. And also your tutors, you interact one-on-one or two-on-one for an hour a week, and then you're left alone with the library to pursue your interests. So that was where I first encountered the false belief task. My tutor at the time was Paul Harris, who now is at Harvard, and was at Oxford at the time, and taught me about the false belief task. And in reading about it, I got totally fascinated, in part because of a disorder I have, which is that I cannot disengage from fiction at all. So I can't watch movies because I get so engaged with them that I suffer them as if they were real. So for example, my husband thinks this is very funny. I can't watch The Incredibles, you know, that cartoon, because there's the scene where they torture the dad, right? So they torture him. He thinks his family is dying and they're torturing him. And so I'm hiding under a cover, like crying. My husband's like, this is an animated movie and he's a superhero. It's obviously going to be fine. And so I got interested in engagement with fiction and why do we engage with fiction? How do we disengage from fiction? Why do some people not disengage from fiction? And that led me to the false belief task.
Sounds like you had no option but to study theory of mind. And say a little bit to us about the fact, I noticed this, that you went to MIT, you got your degree there with Nancy Kenwisher, you did a postdoc with Susan Carey. You've had sort of a string of strong women as your mentors.
I have, at Kia Nobre when I was, at Oxford.
At Oxford, yeah.
I worked for Kia Nobre, the first in a series of very strong women. So this is something I didn't do on purpose, to my knowledge at the time. I actually approached Alan Allport, who was the lecturing in Oxford in my first semester. I approached him at the end of a lecture that I thought was particularly beautiful and asked him if I could work for him. And he said no, he wasn't taking people. But he thought I might like Kia Nobre, who didn't take undergraduates. But I don't know, Kia and I hit it off in a strange way. She doesn't take undergraduates because she doesn't think they work hard enough, or she didn't at the time. But I was prepared to live in her lab, which I then did for the next 2.5 years. And so we came to an agreement. So I worked for her, and then I worked for Nancy, and then I worked for Susan Carey. All three of them kind of take no prisoners intellects.
Yes, that is very true of all of them. The question, you said something about Kia didn't take undergraduates because she believed they didn't, they're just not ready to put the hours in and so on. And I sometimes think that we don't give enough credit to this quality of conscientiousness or perseverance, just hours and hours and hours on the job. Been studying, what do people value when they meet a musician? And it turns out that musicians will say, we know that by the time somebody comes to conservatory level playing, they have all the natural talent that we need. Ultimately, what distinguishes the good from the great is the sheer number of hours. It's the immersion. It's that single-minded pursuit. And
so
yet,
at Oxford, undergraduates didn't have keys to the door, and the door locked at 5. Yeah. And the only source of food after 5 was a snack machine full of Doritos. So I ate Doritos for dinner for a year. In order
yet,
to,
right. I think this is an important thing to know, that ultimately this is what accounts for success. And yet, most of us have this natural, intuitive feeling that we should pick the naturally talented person. We just love this idea that somebody doesn't work and ends up still doing okay on a test. I mean, things like that. And that does not ultimately predict who's going to be successful in our field. And yet there is a very strong preference for that. So that's another bias that we've unearthed that I just want to put out there for you, because many of you will be in the role of selecting other people and so on. And also I think students tend to think that they can work hard, but they may not have this, native smarts or whatever it is. And I think if you ask Dan Wegner, my colleague, he gives a talk to entering graduate students, and he always says that the main predictor of success in graduate school is simply time on task. And I think that is something we don't really value, because this is, I always think we are like the descendants of the monks from the 12th century, where this is the job that's been given to us, is that somebody's going to pay us to do exactly what we want to do. I mean, there's no other profession like that in the world. And so the least we can do is be completely immersed and absorbed in it. So let me say, ask a little bit about how then you've gone around creating your own lab. You've been at this for what, 5-6 years on your own. Do you have a kind of a model of what kind of mentor you want to be? Are there challenges? Are you discovering that there are things about running your own lab and having your own students that you hadn't even thought about when you were a student?
Yeah. Every day. But actually, I think an interesting thing is that I discovered upon reflection that the way to get into my lab, as you were saying, is actually just to keep trying. So the people who end up in my lab are the people who just keep asking to get in. Because I get so many people emailing me, asking me about coming into my lab, that I mostly ignore the first email. It's just too many emails. And almost everybody who has ended up in my lab has ended up there not because I advertised a job. I never advertise jobs. Certainly I don't advertise jobs for postdocs. But people who just keep asking, who ask to come, who ask to visit, who ask to give a talk. So I have 2 postdocs right now who got into my lab just basically by continuing to show up until I hired them. And the undergrads, that's definitely how they make it into the lab. The undergrads who are still there, right, who come to lab meeting, who keep asking for meetings, those are the ones who become lab members. And then they become real lab members, right? We have 5 undergrads in the lab who are equally members of the labs to anybody else, just because they keep showing up. And so to me, I think that's, inadvertently, I use this kind of time on task strategy for picking who stays in the lab. And it feels to me like those are the people who want it that badly are actually the people I want to work with, right? Yeah. So that's selection procedures. So starting and running my lab has been what I've devoted almost all of my time to for the last 5 years. It's consumed almost all of my energy. And I experienced that for a while as a loss. I really missed being a scientist myself. I miss data analysis. I miss coding experiments. I miss counterbalancing. I miss all of the kind of hands-on things. But on the other hand, I've slowly found that mentoring other people through that process is deeply rewarding. And I feel like it's really my job. It's what I do with my time now. I spend 4 days of the week in nonstop meetings with people who are doing the work, mentoring them through the process. And it's intense and demanding and exhausting. But I found
you have a big lab.
Very big, I think. Yeah, so between 15 and 20 people. And that's a lot. It's a lot more than I intended. But it's so rewarding to work with people and watch them become scientists themselves that I'm kind of coming to peace with that being my new job, sort of. Although sometimes they still let me counterbalance things, and that's so great.
I agree. There are the joys of counterbalancing that we undervalue when we're graduate students.
The thing about counterbalancing is when you've done it right, it's done.
Yeah.
Right? It's like that's it. It's over. So great.
And so when you think about what is coming down the pike for you, when you come to a conference like this one and you hear different things, and do you have sort of in your mind a list of, look, the future of psychology is exciting for these reasons, and while you will be doing your stuff right there, which is all we can do. I mean, I always, the T model is what we all try to achieve in some way, deep in our own little world where we are seeking the truth in some very precise way, and nobody else even seems to care about it in some level. In fact, right before we started here, I was saying to Rebecca that a couple of my colleagues will often ask a graduate student at a dissertation meeting to say, why would your grandmother care about this? And my answer is, why should their grandmother care? I hope their grandmother can't understand what they're doing, because this is science. I mean, they're not supposed to understand this. Grandmother should be very proud that you're doing it, but your grandmother need not understand everything that you're doing. In fact, I'd be terrified if your grandmother understood what she's doing. So I think that part we are very secure with, we know. But each of us also, and I think this happens as we get older, where we want to and can begin to see, and we're losing a lot of neurons, so clearly, we can't do exactly the same things as we used to do when we were younger. But we're seeing many more connections between things. And in fact, even within the brain, I'm hoping that is indeed the benefit, that those connections are getting made that will allow us to see things in a whole different way. So you, who's very far from losing neurons yet, is somebody who might sort of already have a picture of where you might head, and maybe you don't, but I just was curious to know.
Yeah, not so. So I definitely feel like I'm not yet at a point of having a kind of big vision of the future of psychology, but I certainly, so when I lose faith in what I'm doing, which happens, with pretty much every failed experiment, I try to remember why I bother. And at one point in a kind of deep crisis of faith a couple of years ago, I sat down for a couple of days to try to figure out why am I engaged, 10 experiments failing in the same month. So why do I do this stuff at all? And this is actually so there's two pieces of this answer to me at the moment, and one of them is why I'm so excited to be talking to you, and maybe you'll let me use that to switch. But so the first one is me as a neuroscientist. So I was trained partly as a neuroscientist. I came motivated by this question about the relationship between neurons and thought. For me, that is one of the deep guiding questions. And as a purely intellectual question, I feel like I want to know how neurons think. To me, it's a completely mind-blowing thought. It never ceases to amaze me when I reflect on it. And it feels like, well, I'm a neuroscientist, a cognitive neuroscientist, and a social cognitive neuroscientist, as well as a psychologist. With that hat on, I feel like there's a huge amount of potential progress, although also a lot of questions, right? fMRI got a free ride for a few years because it was so new and exciting. The images were pretty. And now I think fMRI is coming to a real point of kind of self-consideration and reevaluation of, actually, can we use this tool to study how neurons do thought? Because the interesting thing is, fMRI is neither one of those, right? There's psychology on the one hand, which is really thought, and kind of wet neuroscience on the other hand, which is really neurons. And fMRI seeks to be both, and in so doing is often neither. So for me, one really exciting puzzle right now is to ask, how is fMRI, the main method I use in my lab, contributing to this long-term goal of linking the neuroscientific to the psychological analysis? And again, I feel like actually fMRI is like at a point of trying to figure that out. We got away with, look, thinking is in your brain, and also wanting is in your brain, and also like liking people and disliking people, those are in your brain. And now we're kind of at a point of like, okay, but is this making real contributions to the question we're trying to know? So that to me feels like one really exciting moment, unless the answer is no, and that will be sad. And then the other one for me, is one of the reasons why I've considered Mahzarin a major aspiration target for me since I met her, is that I feel like the things I study are part of knowing what it is to be human, and in particular how we make the decisions that we make that affect other people, which is, in the end, all of what life is about, right? It's about politics and conflict, and any policy decision comes with a problem of, so anytime you make a policy, you have to decide how you're going to get behavioral change to fit with that policy, or why will people follow that rule or respect other people's needs and interests in this context. And so it seems to me there's a really interesting puzzle for the people trying to improve the world of giving them the tools to change behavior effectively. It seems to me that advertisers know a lot more about how to change people's behaviors than politicians or people writing laws. But I'm on the side of the people writing laws, right? I would like to know enough about both how the mind really works, but also our false beliefs about how the mind really works in order to empower people who are trying to make the world a better place to do so more effectively. So in particular, I think theory of mind is a very powerful tool we have intuitively in our heads. It's an intuitive psychology. It's extremely powerful for everyday life. Intuitive physics, likewise, is an extremely powerful theory of the physical world that works very well in real life. But if you tried to go to the moon on intuitive physics, you would miss. And I feel like similarly, in trying to make policies, if we are using only our intuitive psychology, we will fail to achieve the kind of large-scale societal goals that we have. So I think studying intuitive psychology and trying to understand how it's different from the real mind and why it's different is part of this process. So to me, the second thing that I'm really interested in is seeing how psychology and psychological research can influence and change kind of societal and policy decisions. And what I have always admired so much about you is that it feels to me like you've gone through your career always keeping your eye on that ball, which is, okay, we're doing psychological research, which is interesting because it's just an interesting intellectual puzzle, but also we want to figure out how to do science that will have implications for the real world, and then if we find answers that do have such implications, how to communicate them so that they actually have an impact, which I think is an amazing accomplishment.
So it may seem that way to you, but I did not look up from the most basic laboratory bench for many, many years. So, and even now, when a student comes to want to work with me, if they come because they're interested in an applied problem, I will try to determine whether that is something that they're willing to put off for several years. Because if they cannot, and I occasionally have students, even in a class, where if I'm teaching a course because of the kind of topic it might be, they'd come thinking, I'm going to show them how to change the world. And I've had students say, Professor, I will not take your class because you're not going to show me how to change the world in my lifetime. And I say, I think that's a very fine decision. You should not be in this class because that is not my job here. But, and so I would say that there is a very big mistake we could make if we want to start to apply before we know. But as you build, I do think that there are individual differences. And my job has always been to defend those people who want to never do an applied thing in their life, right? So if I'm giving advice to NSF or somebody, I'll just say, look, I think that one of the biggest fears I have is that there's going to be a demand made of us to apply and to say something about the world long before we're ready. And I see that as really, really dangerous. I love the idea of leaving scientists to just do whatever they want to do with no real plan for any application. So when Mr. Hertz was asked if Hertz was ever going to have any value, he said no, he didn't see any practical value in it, right? So I do think that on the one hand. On the other hand, I have to say that I yearn for that kind of application, and as I've gotten older, I have tried to do it, and I have done it in ways that I have been hugely criticized for. So just the idea of opening the website.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you, so one of the results that or one of the processes that you're sort of famously attached to is the IAT, which has come to be a major interface where people, or the idea of implicit social cognition, is a topic that now is getting spread outside of psychology to a huge audience and seems like it could have a really big impact on society. And so one of the things I wondered is, could you talk about what was the origins of that science? Like, were you planning for it to be a major education campaign that would change the way judges thought about their cases?
No, absolutely not. The big accident in my life that paid off hugely was that I met Tony Greenwald, who not only taught me how to do good science, but who was bold in those right moments. And I think that when you do something outrageous like that, to say, okay, we've been studying this for a while, and in 1998, when not many people were on the web, we opened this website. And we had there was another accident that, again, paid off hugely, and that was the arrival of Brian Nosek as a graduate student in my lab. So I've had this extraordinary life where 3 generations of scientists have worked together. Tony was my advisor, Brian was my student, and the 3 of us, I think, had a similar vision of what we were doing, but we also had this belief that we needed to have this work belong somewhere outside the journals. And it came, again, not from a plan, but because when we took our own tests, we were just shocked by what we were observing in our own minds. I mean, what our minds were doing that we had no clue about. And that moment, the kind of humility you get in that, milliseconds after you've taken the test, that something is going to now emerge telling you that you are not the person you thought you were. And my first thought after I took the first IAT was to just bury the result, to never tell a soul, and to hope that nobody ever asks. And then the next moment you know that when something like that happens, it's important to try to share it with others and to see if they have the same reactions. And so in 1998, when we opened the website, it's true that as a public device, it was immediately and incredibly popular. In the first month, we had 40,000 completed tests. And we went to the web for many reasons, but one of the reasons I went to the web was that I taught at Yale at the time. It had a very small subject pool. And then I thought, this will be a nice way to get a few more subjects. I had no idea what few more meant. I thought in a year we'll get about 500 people, and won't that be a nice experiment? And so we were completely taken aback when in the first month we had 40,000. And we knew that there was that. But within the field, there were people who were vastly critical, and we had to give them good answers for why we thought that this was a reasonable way for us to proceed. And there are still people who are critical. They don't like it. They believe that this is not the right thing to do, but they're a minority. By and large, I think that we've persuaded people. And of course now, lots and lots of people are on the web, and in fact, the board, the APS board, did have a discussion about what are we going to do with all the data that are now coming in via the web. Many of you are now using the web, and I actually worry about that. I worry because I don't know that MTurk or whatever is giving us the very best data at all. In fact, I don't know if we can trust much of those data. I was just educated by a small group of people who are trying to understand this, about the fact that Mechanical Turk is being used in many other countries by people who just come to the website to serve as subjects, who set up little macros that can replicate their results automatically so that they make more money. And we get data that look like the standard deviation is very small, and we're very happy with the data, right? So we're going to need to do some hard work about how we gather these data. But I just was very lucky in the collaborators that I had. Yeah.
So speaking of who you thought you were, can you talk a little bit about where you were born and raised?
Okay, well, that's a very long story. So I'll give you the long version of the long story. I was born and raised in India. I am the child of people who would have come from Central Asia in the 9th century to India. They're called Zoroastrians, Parsis. It's regarded to be the first monotheistic religion in the world, predating Judaism by about 1,500, 2,000 years. And this is an odd group of people. They moved from what is now Iran to India in the 9th century because they wanted religious asylum. They're called often the Jews of India because they've had a similar kind of history in some ways and so on. But it's a very small group, and it's going to die because there are 80,000 left in the world, but they tend not to accept intermarriages, certainly no conversion, and so on. So it's an odd kind of group, and someday I think I might want to write about this group and the decisions it's making that are not in its interests because it believes that it's so special that it cannot accept any new people into it who are not born of people who are within the group. And to me, given the work I do, this seems completely insane because there's nothing that we have that's that special. We're just one of many different groups. So I was born into that kind of group, but also had a mother who, unlike yours, had just finished high school, and then she had gone off and gotten trained to be a Montessori school teacher, and put me to work very early teaching other people. So I was a very sick kid and didn't leave home and was more or less homeschooled until I got into high school. And the way she kept me on track was to get me to teach somebody who was a problem kid in her class. And so when I was 5, I was teaching 4-year-olds and so on. So I feel I was always a natural teacher. I cared about getting into the mind of this other person, figuring out why they were struggling or why they were having trouble with something and fixing it. That was the engineer in me, I think. And through a series of great big accidents, I came to psychology. But the big change for me was moving from India to the United States. And it really happened because I found a bunch of books. The Handbook of Social Psychology was published in India so it could be made available cheaply. So that you paid about $1 per volume. So for $5, I thought, that's a lot of book for the money. I'm going to buy it. And I had absolutely no idea that this was going to, in some ways, change what I wanted to do in my future, as opposed to the fact that I was going through college and doing all of this. And that book really made me see that the two things I had done, on the one hand, I had studied in college, we did a lot of psychophysical experiments, and all those were quite intriguing, but arrowheads and featherheads can only go that far. And I switched all the way over, and I thought, I want to do something that feels more real, and I went to this Marxist university where I studied sociology. And I knew that that was not for me. Ultimately, the polishing of a single experiment and making it shine, that's where the interest was. And I thought, where do they do this kind of thing? And it seemed like they did it in America. So I packed a bag, mostly filled with the 5 volumes of the Handbook of Social Psychology. And I came, and this will shock you all, because you in this audience, you've all orchestrated your careers in the appropriate way. You knew what you were doing, more or less. You knew what the schools were. I went to somebody who was an engineer, because a lot of Indian engineers would come to the United States, but nobody in psychology in 1979 was applying to go to graduate school in psychology. And so I asked a few engineers, what do you do if you want to go study in America? And they said, well, we know what our ranks are here, so I'll apply to Caltech, and he'll apply to Stanford, and he'll apply to MIT, and we know what we're going to do. But in psychology, we don't know what you should do, so why don't you just apply to any school that has the word state in it? They seem to take anybody. That's what I was saying. I thought, oh, this is wonderful, a country where there are schools where they'll take anybody. So I applied to Ohio State and Michigan State and Iowa State and Kansas State. I really did. That's how, and when I say accident, and where did I end up? I ended up, by randomly selecting, I ended up in what is a very decent place, Ohio State, but that had an absolutely astounding social psychology program. Okay? There's 4 of them, that's it. Bib Latané taught me my first groups course. Tony Greenwald, of course, was my advisor. Tom Ostrom was making the revolution on social cognition by editing many of the first books on that, and Tim Brock. And those 4 people they knew, I think, that the riffraff like me were the ones who were going to come, and they just took the job of training so seriously that it was hard. Graduate school was definitely not fun in many ways. And there was almost no letting up, because no matter what you did, those 4 people were not satisfied. You had to, you couldn't do anything that they would think was amazing. And I didn't recognize the value of that. I didn't recognize, because I didn't know what I was capable of, and I had no idea what the standard should be. All I knew is that I wasn't matching what they wanted me to be. And after 4.5 years of that, I'd had it. So I did leave. I went off and I became a postdoc to people in a very different lab. So Beth Loftus and Claude Steele, who are my postdoctoral mentors, and a very different model of science. They thought it could be fun. They thought you could actually, just sit in an office and generate ideas and things. And that was a completely different model, and I would not trade one for the other, but they were very different.
So I was going to ask you exactly on those lines what kind of mentorship you experienced and how it informs your kind of plan of mentorship for your own students.
So I don't know if I should say this, but I guess I'll tell you. When I was at Yale, and I had been advising people for a good 8 years or so, I learned that there was a little computer lab around the corner, and the computers were named different names. And there were 2 computers. One was named for me, the Wire Mother, and the other was named the cloth mother for my friend Peter Salovey, who was my very... And I think, so I tried to ask myself, you know, should I be proud of this or should I be hurt by this? I chose to be proud of it because I figured this is at least good for gender stereotypes. You know, it's the woman who is the wire mother and this man who is the fuzzy cloth mother. But you know, and over the years, that has changed, and recently I was given a big monkey that is very fuzzy, that has wire mother written on it, and so. So I do think that I too brought to my own training this sense that I'm going to take you very seriously enough that things will not feel so comfortable. You will get comments from me, and you will hear things that are not what you might want to hear. But over the years, either the students I'm now getting are much more amazing, or I have gotten to be more cloth-like or something. But I do think that my model now is far less sort of a stringent one of here's what I think is the right path. I think I did believe that I knew that there was a particular right path, and now I know that I have amazing people who come, many of whom, you know, most of course go off and become university professors, but some choose not to. Some become science writers and they do other things, and I think I now know that that is also something that I can give to people, that they can come, get a PhD in psychology. In fact, I think everybody should get a PhD in psychology and then go off and do whatever they want, become congresspeople or whatever it is that they want to do, and the world would be far better for that. So now it's a very different kind of a model.
So this is actually exactly one of the questions I wanted to ask you, which is, so now, you know, having the opportunity, especially having been president of APS, to really see psychology in a broad sense and also how it interacts in the world, I'm curious about what you think is the future for how psychology actually can make the world a better place.
I mean, psychology can make the world a better place by simply teaching us the truth, right? So Martin Luther King Jr. gave a talk at an APA conference only a few weeks, I think, before he was assassinated, in which he said that what he thought psychologists should do to change the world is simply one thing, and that is you tell it like it is, he said. And I've been very taken by that because, in a sense, whatever we discover, and by the way, in our lab, we have often discovered things that are politically scary to discover. Not just that we have these things in our heads that we didn't know about and so on, but just things that you would not really expect at all to find, and where it looks like the initial data are not what a good liberal would think, you know? That when you put diverse groups of people and make them work together, that it does not work, that people do not get along, that they don't hold hands and sing Kumbaya, that living in a multiracial city, a big city like New York or LA, actually might make you even more biased because if you don't have friends who come from other communities. These are not the results that you want to see, but to tell it like it is the only thing we can do, right? Because then we can figure out how to deal with it. You know, but I think, so I would say that one of the most important things we can do is to do exactly that, and let the applications come in the few people who actually care to do that, but not to have anything. I think this conference has actually told me that we did the right thing in picking convergence as the theme. So when I started graduate school, there was nothing convergence about psychology. We were all in our own little groups. I even remember going to Midwestern Psychology Association, and even within the same symposium, people would literally cluster into different quadrants of the room when they heard talks. You know, it was just a sense that there were the social cognition people, and then there were the relationships people, and there were the personality people. And that has just gone. And I think that for those of you who are young, you may not actually appreciate how wonderful this moment is. And maybe we'll always go back and forth between this sort of, you know, the tea. But I do think right now there is convergence. I just thought yesterday on the presidential symposium, I sort of put these people together because I do think they do amazing work. But it was remarkable to me that we started with Laurie Santos, you know, who talked about monkeys, where imagine the study literally means, you know, opening a little flap and letting a monkey look at one of two pictures and coding how long they look to it, to Susan Fiske, who talked about the elderly and immigration and so on, right? all of this is social cognition, and that's one little field within the big one. So I have great faith that we're heading right now in exactly the right direction.
So one line of research that I've heard you mention a few times is something you're doing right now that I'd like to know more about, is that you're working on institutional corruption. So what are you doing with that?
Institutional corruption. So we know that institutions are corrupt. We know that many institutions fail to meet their mission. And I would add to that the idea that even if an institution is not corrupt, but that the public has lost trust in it, then I would say it's not doing its job, right? So if you look at these two facts, there are lots of institutions that are corrupt. And Harvard has an institute called the Safra Center for the Study of Ethics, which has had a ton of money in it. And all of that money has been largely controlled by a small group of people who are political philosophers. For many years, they had wonderfully extravagant dinners using this money. And then along came a man by the name of Larry Lessig, who some of you may have heard of, because he's been interested in open software stuff. He was a professor of law at Stanford, and actually fought the first sort of antitrust case against Microsoft and so on. So he's a believer in opening things up. Anyway, he's come as director, and he said, we need to have a Safra lab, and the Safra lab she'll take on the mission of trying to solve the problem of institutional corruption. And anybody from any science, from any of the social sciences, can apply for little grants to see if they can help us understand issues of conflict of interest or what we meant. And I think our big advantage is that we know that institutional corruption, even though most people think it's a few bad actors, right? So we think about Bernie Madoff, and we think, yeah, if only we can catch the few Bernie Madoffs, well, things will be fine. But we're psychologists, and we know a lot better. We know that institutional corruption happens from ordinary people doing everyday things that are under huge constraint, who are trying in their very well-intentioned way of doing the right thing but fail. And that there are these situational constraints, and then there are these individual differences, and that it's in everybody. So I think just bringing that idea out, that corruption is ordinary. It's not this kind of thing that a few people do. So basically the idea is to take what we already know from psychology and to apply it to why the pharmaceutical industry funds research the way it does. It is to look at the smoking industry and why we still have, people who make cigarettes and people who are paying money to buy them. We want to understand, what happened exactly on Wall Street that we will only know over the next several years and so on. And so I'm a believer that these little things that we learn really are speaking to something much bigger. And the hope is that next year while I'm on sabbatical, I'll spend time doing that. And,
do you think we should take questions for?
We're happy, yes.
Minutes?
I think we should. We're happy to take questions from the audience. So if you have any, please direct them to Rebecca or me. Yeah. We didn't prepare you to ask questions, so maybe you have none. Or maybe our lives are too boring to ask anything of us. Yes.
I very much enjoyed this interaction. And I agree that in many ways psychology is moving forward, is doing many great things.
Can you talk a little louder so people in the back can hear you?
Not that you can answer it today, but I really think we psychologists should focus a little bit more on where we're going wrong, where we're making our mistakes. We should pay attention to history. I like to go back to some of the journals a couple of decades ago, and all the wonderful excitements have disappeared. Nobody mentions them. We often don't correct our mistakes from the past, and we just always gloriously facing the future with great smiles. I'm a psychologist, I'm proud of it, so I'm not necessarily a negative person, but I'm eager to see a bit more self-criticism. All right, so that's not really a question, but almost a plea for great authorities of psychology.
So I think Matt is saying we need to be more self-reflective and self-critical. I would agree, obviously, but I want to ask you, don't you feel that there's something inherent about a science that makes it self-correcting in some way? Or do you think that this is just a kind of a loose hope? But I do feel that I can't sit out there and just say something and have it, be assumed to be true. I, in particular, feel like I'll get a lot of people saying you're wrong, and pretty quickly, usually people in my own lab. So I don't know, I feel like there's something, yeah, Antonia.
You said something earlier that I wanted to ask you to comment more, that psychology was different from other sciences, that the field is not there yet with a list of basic questions that they would have. I want to make an observation and feel free to tear apart. I'm just curious how you think about it with your experiences. Just that from an outsider's point of view, when you look at the amazing body of work that is being done by this community, exactly, many people study the same fundamental questions, just that there is a tendency to call them different things.
Yeah.
So I would say that you guys have figured out what the fundamental questions are. It's just that you don't like labeling them.
Yeah.
Questions.
Yeah.
Because it introduces competition. I don't know. Please comment.
That's a very, very good point. I think many people are doing very similar things, calling them different names and so on. And I used to see that only as a downside, okay? Because I thought, for one reason I think we do that is because we do not formalize things. If we could formalize them, we would see that mathematically they're all the same, for example, and then all these are just labels and so on. But I have been working in an area where there are sort of two aspects to something that has to do with intention, you know. So Dan Wagner will have two names for it, and he'll call it agency and experience, and, you know, Josh Knobe will call the same thing intention and phenomenology. But I do have the feeling that they're each, because the complexity of this is so huge, that by giving these different names, they are touching different parts of this elephant. And that in some ways I don't want us to very quickly say, okay, let's just agree on this label. For us, the language that we use to label things are actually a very complex way of saying it's a particular kind of thing that I'm talking about that may be different from you. But I assume that as we mature, that will happen, that there will not. Somebody said that I think it was David Brooks who said that he didn't think that the term emotion would be around in 50 years. That he didn't think that that would be any need for it because it's too big and too complex, and we will think of it as some, you know, old way in which we give a name to something too big for us to even know what we meant. So I think it'll happen. So I am looking forward to us having some template of, you know, what are some of the big questions that we study. I just don't want it to be defined by a few people, and so I'd like it to. And I don't know if you have thoughts about this. Yeah. Other questions? Can we wind up?
There's one more right here.
What advice would you give to students who are trying to get into graduate school but seem to be having difficulty either due to resources or lack of research experience?
Yeah, I was going to say the most important thing for getting into graduate school is research experience. Mm-hmm. And that's a real problem if you are in a place where there aren't a lot of resources to get research experience. So this is something that actually I've been thinking about for a while because it seems like quite a catch-22 we're putting people in where we want people to come in. I actually think it makes a lot of sense to get research experience before you go to graduate school for lots of reasons, one of which is just to make sure you like it because lots and lots of research is incredibly dull. And many people are moved by the deep questions of psychology, but don't enjoy spending 14 hours debugging their counterbalancing code, which, as I said, is my favorite thing. But if it's not your favorite thing, it's good to know that before you get into a graduate school program. And so I think there's a reason why we're looking for research experience in students. It shows time on task, it shows commitment, it also shows that you like it and you're willing to keep doing it. So there's various different strategies that I would advise. The first thing is that in America, unlike anywhere else that I've ever been, there are jobs for full-time research assistants who haven't yet gone to graduate school in most labs, which I think is, so in England and in Canada, that is not the case. If you're an undergraduate and you want to keep doing science, you have to go to graduate school. But in America, there are jobs for people to work full-time as a lab manager for a year or two. And those provide a lot of research assistant experience. Most of them are not advertised. So if you want such a job, you should know that many labs, most labs at major research universities have those jobs and may not be advertising them. And so the way to find out about them is to write to people who you're interested in. Now, I can tell you very easy advice for what to do when you're writing to people. So when both when I advertise jobs and when I don't advertise jobs, I get these things all the time. The last time I advertised such a job, I got 400 applicants. The first thing I checked was, did they know what lab they were applying to? And that eliminates half. So, so in particular, when I advertise a job, it says that it's the Social Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience Lab at MIT, but it doesn't say my name. If you Google social neuroscience at MIT, I'm the only one. If I asked how many people in their cover letter addressed it to me, the answer was 8 out of 400. And 2 of them got the job, 2 of those 8. So I would say that, again, as common advice, it's the same thing as getting into grad school, it's the same thing as getting into my lab as an undergrad, that showing that you have paid attention. I interviewed 2 people for one of the jobs in my lab last year, and I asked them both, have you read any papers from my lab? They had known for 3 weeks they were going to be interviewed, and one had and one hadn't. The one had got the job. So showing that you're paying attention, that you really mean it, that you really want to do this work, and putting yourself out there for the work, not worrying about the fact that many people won't reply to you. Josh Tenenbaum was a colleague of mine, gave me advice that I think about constantly, which is if somebody hasn't replied to your email, they're probably just busy. This is true 98% of the time. It's not that they don't like you, and it's not that you're not good enough. It's just that they're busy and distracted and have too many things on their plate. And it's always worth trying again, because what have you got to lose? And if you want it, just keep showing up. That's my advice.
With that, I think we should bring this to a close. And thank you all for coming and listening to us chat.